In this video lesson about the Troubles, we're going to have a look at the 30 years in the history of Northern Ireland, those years that go from 1968 to 1998, the birth of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, the soaring of the tension and of the violence in the early 70s, with the blackest year 1972, the situation in the late 70s, with the protest in the Maze, until the bombing in UK, in Downing Street, the cheese fire in 1994, the lay arms of the IRA, and the Good Friday Agreement 1998. To start with this lesson, we are going to have a look at where we started from in the first episode of the history of Northern Ireland. We said that from the 15th century, Ireland was ruled by the British, who exploited its land and its people. In the 19th century, most of the country was in the hands of a small number of English Anglo-Irish Protestants, landowners who did not live on their lands. The Catholic Irish peasants had to pay taxes to these absentee landlords, even when they could hardly keep their families on what was left to them of their agricultural produce. Their state of poverty was so abject that when in 1845-1846 a blight destroyed the potato crop, which was the basic food of the Irish, the famine killed 1 million, and another million emigrated to escape starvation. In the introduction to the Victorian age, we have already said that Ireland today is the only European country that has a population that is lower in 2020 than it was in the Victorian age, that it was in the 19th century. Except for short intervals, Ireland had been governed, or we can say misgoverned, by the Parliament in London. A movement demanding an independent Irish state gained some strength towards the end of the 19th century. This is the Home Rule movement. And the Home Rule Bill was twice introduced in Westminster and twice defeated. Home Rule was eventually passed in 1914, as you can see on the slide, but it was suspended until the World War I was over. The Home Rule was opposed by the Protestants of the 6 counties in the northeast. This region, which had been largely settled by Scottish and English immigrants in the 17th century. They threatened to secede, using force if necessary, if a Home Rule was granted. Taking advantage of the British involvement in World War I, the Republican volunteers led the insurrection of the Easter 1916 to gain the independence of the island. The rebellion failed and its leaders were executed, as we said in the other video lesson, the other podcast, which caused great resentment in Britain. In 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty sanctioned the partition of the island in the 26 counties which formed the Irish Free State and the 6 northern counties which opted out to remain British. As you can see from the map, bottom left, the situation of the island at the beginning of 1922 is basically the partition that we can still see today. After World War II, the Irish Free State becomes the Republic of Ireland, an independent country outside the Commonwealth, and the Irish question moves to Northern Ireland. The Protestant Unionists, the richer and the better educated part of the society, want Ulster to remain part of the United Kingdom, whereas the less privileged Catholic nationalists, supported by the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, want to reunite Ulster to the Republic of Ireland. Tension accumulates between the two religious sects, and the IRA organizing an armed campaign which, at the beginning, is a failure, and a peaceful solution seems possible. In 1968, a civil rights campaign is launched to fight discrimination against Catholics, which were discriminated in housing, employment and political rights. Demonstrations and disorders take place in Derry and Belfast, and the state reacts to this agitation by banning marches. There is a growing feeling amongst the nationalist community that police officers were biased, and the RUC is seen as particularly heavy-handed in response to these orders. Violence breaks out in Northern Ireland in 1969 with rioting between the civil rights activists and the RUC police force. To this is quickly added another dimension as Protestant or loyalist vigilante groups, including the Ulster Volunteer Force, that had been refounded in 1966, fight sometimes with the police, sometimes alongside with them, attacking Catholic areas, particularly in parts of Belfast. The annual Apprentice Boys March in Derry is due to take place on the 12th of August 1969. There are calls from community leaders to cancel the parade. Ultimately, it goes ahead. Riots follows, leading to what became known as the Battle of the Bogside. After several days, the RUC was at breaking point and the new Minister of Northern Ireland calls in the army. British troops are sent in to restore the order. British troops are firstly warmly welcomed in Catholic neighbourhood as an important force who could be relied on, unlike the RUC or the Auxiliary B Specials, to defend them from the Loyalists. It also seemed feasible to these Catholic activists or to these Catholic groups, as the more moderate element of the civil rights movement envisaged, that the British government in London could be an arbitrator for reform of Northern Ireland, including equal treatment for the Catholics and some form of power sharing between nationalists and unionists. To balance reforms of Northern Ireland with the power of the autonomous unionist administration that had been operating since 1922 and with the unionist public opinion is the toughest challenge for the British government, because the public opinion wants terrorists to be put down. By terrorism, they mean the armed opposition to the state formed by the Republicans, the IRA that has backed the civil rights movement and built support across the sectarian divide, the IRA that still dedicates to the traditional objective of a united Ireland by means of an armed campaign. The summer of 1969 brings an end to many things, including Catholics and Protestants living side by side. After August 1969, the country develops total polarization with sectarianization and ghettoization. The barricades went up and they never really came down, according to some political observers. The civil rights movements had been on the streets for more than a year and demanded basic democratic rights that could have been conceded peacefully had the unionist government or London been foresighted enough to see it. But everything went the wrong way. We said that the British troops are initially welcomed by both sides as a peacekeeping force. The confluence of unionist pressure and the threat from Republican paramilitaries means that increasingly the British Army is being used in nationalist districts as a replacement for the RUC, not only to restore public order but to combat the IRA, which also leads to harsh measures towards the nationalist population in general. In July 1970, the Lower Falls area of Belfast is put under curfew by several thousand troops, who arrest over 300 people and kill 4 civilians in gang battles. In 1971, the violence escalates between IRA on one side, 220 bombs across the Northern Ireland were discharged in the first 6 months of 1971, and the British troops and Protestant paramilitaries on the other. In Derry, the shooting by the army of 2 Catholic youths in July 1971 caused the Social Democratic and Labour Party to withdraw from the Stormont Parliament and break off negotiation with both Unionists and the British government. Street battles are taking place regularly all through Northern Ireland. In order to stem the IRA terrorist attacks, London introduces the internment of suspects without trial in Northern Ireland, as it had done in 1922 to defeat Republican campaigns in the north, and as it had repeated in the late 1950s. But the context today in 1971 was very different. Now, a significant proportion of the Catholic population was mobilized, but especially was radicalized in both violent and non-violent resistance to the state. The IUC intelligence was poor, and many of those arrested had no connection at all with the Republican paramilitaries, who conversely seemed to have been well aware of a roundup when it was coming. Thirdly, the behavior of the troops carrying out the operation, often like the paratroopers in Ballymurphy, was in many cases brutal. In the first morning, the internment was introduced. 340 people were picked up from their houses, all but 2 were Catholic and nationalists. Over the next 4 days, 20 people, over the next 4 days after the internment without a trial was introduced, 24 people were killed in rioting and gang battles across the Northern Ireland. Some 7,000 people, both Catholics and Protestants, were expelled from their homes. The decision to introduce the internment without trial damaged the image of the British government and its army in Northern Ireland abroad. They had carried out what was seen as a one-sided and arbitrary operation against the Northern Catholic community at the behest of the Unionists, and they were accused of torture. In the shorter term, Northern Ireland was plunged into a near-revolutionary situation. Nationalists withdrew from participation in the local government. The Civil Rights Association called a rent and rates strike, which was largely observed in nationalist area. Some 80,000 workers staged a one-day strike in Derry against the internment. Had the demographic realities of Northern Ireland been different, this might have spelled the end for the northern state. But the fact remained that the Unionists were a majority of nearly 3-1 in the 6 counties. Northern Catholic nationalists could not win by themselves. So, the result of internment was not victory for one side or the other, but was simply more violence. A proposal set up a government with Protestant and Catholic in Ulster sharing power failed because of the Unionist opposition, and the IRA attack increased in England, as you can see from the picture. This picture is taken from the late 71. Internment has increased the terrorist activity, perhaps boosted IRA recruitment, polarized further the Catholic and the Protestant communities, and reduced the ranks of the much needed Catholic moderates. This is what has been said by some prisoners that were interviewed later. In fact, one of these prisoners that was interned without a trial witnessed the second quotation. Witnessed the second line, which is, "We were stripped naked." They say, "Do you want a Guinness?" Outside, you were introduced to a dog called Guinness, a big brute. In those days, it was complete physical violence, hot and cold baths, pulling your testicles, pulling your hair. They just fucked you into hot water and held you down. It's terrible when you have nothing to tell them. The internment without trial became a recruiting more than a repressive instrument, we said, and it encouraged more people to come forward and assist the IRA rather than discourage them. Anti-internment rallies became frequent. Notably, on the 22nd of January 1972, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association held a march in McGilligan Strand, County Londonderry. The soldiers from the parachute regiment and the Green Jackets stopped the demonstration with a fence of barbed wire as they approached the internment camp. Security forces deployed gas and used batons and rubber bullets against the protesters. A week after the event at McGilligan, on Sunday the 30th of January 1972, 13 people were killed and 15 injured at an anti-internment march in Derry, when the soldier from the parachute regiment opened fire on demonstrators. The day became known as Bloody Sunday. There was outrage in the United Kingdom and beyond. In the Republic of Ireland there were mass protests. A national day of mourning was announced in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, which saw the closure of shops, businesses and transport activities. Thousands attended a march in Dublin, and some demonstrators made their way to Marion Square, where the British Embassy building was set alight. What happened on Bloody Sunday strengthened the provisional IRA, increased nationalist resentment and hostility towards the army, and exacerbated the violent conflict of the years that followed. What happened on Bloody Sunday also marked the end of the power for Brian Faulkner, the Prime Minister of the Northern Ireland, who asked the British government for permission to bring back the B specials and to allow the IUC to carry guns again, which London refused. London instead, asked the Northern Ireland government to give up its power over law and order. In late March, the British government announced that it was going to take control of security in Northern Ireland. It was going to appoint a member of the British government to take care of the running of Northern Ireland. It was planning to hold a vote on whether or not there should be a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and it was going to talk to the politicians to see if government made up of members from all parties could be set up. Losing control over security was too much for the Stormont government, and so all the members decided to resign in protest. The Prime Minister, Edward Heath, then announced that he was going to close the Northern Ireland government and Parliament down and start running Northern Ireland directly from London with the Secretary of State, which is known as direct rule. The IRA, of course, welcomed the end of Stormont, but it was less happy at the appointment of the Secretary of State. It saw direct rule as evidence of even greater British involvement in the running of Northern Ireland and announced its determination to continue its struggle to achieve a united Ireland. Bloody Friday, in fact, see the picture above left, is the name given to the bombing in Belfast on the 21st of July 1972. At least 20 bombs exploded. Most of them were car bombs and most targeted infrastructure, especially transport network. 9 people were killed, 5 were civilians, 4 were soldiers or police officers, and 130 were injured. The bombings were partly a response to the breakdown of talks between the IRA and the British government. Altogether, in 1972, the IRA carried out 1,300 bombings. However, Bloody Friday was a major setback for the IRA, and there was a backlash against the organization. Immediately after the bombings, the security forces carried out raids on the homes of the Republicans. 10 days later, the British Army launched the Operation Motorman, in which it retook the no-go areas controlled by the Republicans. Loyalist paramilitaries also reacted to the bombings by carrying out revenge attacks on Catholic civilians. Let's have a look now at the events from the mid-1970s to the early 1980s. In 1974, under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, the IRA becomes an illegal organization in Britain. People traveling from Northern Ireland to Britain are examined and emergency powers are conferred to the police forces. This act is passed as a severe and emergency reaction to the Birmingham pub bombs by the IRA on the 21st of November 1974, where 21 people died and 184 people were injured. There is a strong desire to respond to what was perceived as the greatest threat to the country since the end of the Second World War. The power that were given to Britain were unprecedented in peacetime. In Ulster, Protestant groups torture and murder Catholics. Talks between British government and Sinn Féin fail and lead nowhere. In 1975, internment without trial is phased out. During the internment period, around 2,000 people were detained without trial in Northern Ireland, of whom 95% are Catholic and 5%, that is just 100, are loyalists. Internment ended on the 5th of December 1975, but the camps in which the internees were held were about to become a central focus of the conflict. As Shimusini says at the beginning of this poem, "This morning from a dewy motorway I saw the new camp for the internees." That is basically picturing the transformation of these camps from camps for the internees without trial into the infamous maze with the H blocks. Let's see what that means. In 1972, the Secretary of State had introduced a special category status for those sentenced for crimes relating to the civil violence. In 1975, when the internment ended, that is on the 5th of December 1975, there were 1,100 of these prisoners in the prison. The special category status gave them some privileges, which included free association between prisoners, extra visits, food passes, and the right to wear their own clothes rather than the prison uniforms. However, special category status was short-lived, and after the internment without trial was ended, also the special category status was ended in March 1976 as a part of a new British policy of criminalization and coinciding, of course, with the end of the internment. Those convicted on scheduled terrorist offences after that date, after March 1976, were housed in 8 new H blocks that had been constructed at Long Cache, the prison Shimusini speaks about in this poem. Prisoners began protesting. They refused to wear the prison uniforms, stating that the convicted criminals and not the political criminals were wearing uniforms. Not allowed their own clothes, they wrapped themselves in bed sheets, and the blanket protest began. In March 1978, some prisoners refused to leave their cells to shower or to use the lavatory, and were provided with wash-hand bathing in their cells, which they refused to use. When rumors spread across these wings of the H blocks, that some prisoner who had refused had been badly beaten, the prisoners responded by smashing the furniture into their cells and by refusing to leave their cells. And as a consequence, the prison officers were unable to clear them. This resulted in the blanket protest escalating into the dirty protest, as the prisoner would not leave their cells and started smearing excrements on the wall. After months of protest, finally, in 1981, the prisoners went on a hunger strike. By the end of August 1981, 10 prisoners had died. The first was Bobby Sand, above in the mural, who became the symbol of the IRA martyrs. Back to the 1979, the IRA had become more and more daring. A close associate of the Prime Minister and a member of the royal family, Lord Mountbatten, who is the uncle of Prince Philip, Elizabeth II's husband, were killed. In 1984, the IRA bombed a Brighton hotel where the Conservative Party was holding its annual conference. In 1985, Britain and Ireland signed the Anglo-Irish Treaty Agreement, which recognizes Ulster as a part of the UK so long as this is supported by the majority of the people in the north. The Protestant Unionists strongly oppose this move because they see it as the first step towards Irish unity. In the years between 1989 and 1993, the Provisional IRA increases its terrorist campaign with bombs both in Ulster and in Britain. In the picture left, you can see that Downing Street is attacked on the 7th of January 1991 in an assassination attempt on John Major and his war cabinet, who were meeting to discuss the Gulf War. 2 shells overshot Downing Street and failed to explode, and 1 shell exploded in the rear garden. Protestant extremists murdered Catholics in Ulster in retaliation. In December 1993, the Prime Minister John Major and his Irish counterpart Reynolds signed a historic declaration affirming the right of self-determination for the people in Northern Ireland. It was only about on the 31st of August 1994 that Sinn Féin, the IRA political wing, announces a ceasefire by the IRA, promising a complete close of military operation. Hopes for putting an end to the 25 years of bloodshed run very high, and London asks for an IRA disarmament before peace talks can begin. 1996, IRA announces the end of the ceasefire with a bomb beneath London. The year after, for the first time, 2 Sinn Féin representatives were elected members of Parliament under Blair's government. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 provided for the devolution of a variety of powers to the Northern Ireland Assembly and dealt with central issues as civil rights, decommissioning of weapons, and the relationship between Northern Ireland and Britain, and Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The agreement introduced power sharing in the new Northern Ireland Assembly and replaced the hated HUC with a new police service that included both Protestant and Catholic officers. The agreement was accepted by a referendum. In 2001, IRA began to hand over its weapons, although the situation still remained highly volatile until 2005, when the IRA officially ended its armed campaign against the British occupation. Probably a new chapter will begin with Brexit, but who knows? It's too early to tell. I really thank you for listening to this lesson, to this podcast about the Troubles, these 30 years of Northern Irish history. I would wish you could read Lyra McGee articles on The Guardian, and I leave you underneath the sources and 10 best films about the Troubles. Thank you very much. Cheers.